If you own a 10 to 15-year-old Mercedes-Benz, at some point you're probably going to have to deal with spark plugs. Now, this is something that you can do yourself. You know, it's going to take a few tools. It's not real difficult. It's not what I would say a beginner, but it's certainly, you know, after the beginner phase, this is something that you can tackle and do, and you may actually end up doing it better than some shop. You'll learn a little bit more about that later in this video. And you may be asking yourself, well, why would I need to be concerned about this? Don't spark plugs last a long time? Once again, we'll answer that a little bit later in this video. But let me share with you a quick example. I recently saw the receipts from an E320 on a shop that replaced the spark plugs and the spark plug wires. The bill was $890. That's right, $890. And there's obviously, if you price those parts out, there's a lot of room in there to save some money. So why are spark plugs so important in my book? I find they get neglected, even though they may last 60,000 miles. You say, well, I just bought this Mercedes, you know, it's 12 years old, and I see that the plugs have been changed, so why do I have to worry about it for the next 50, 60,000 miles? Let me explain. Here I go harping on spark plugs again. You're probably going to hear me harp about them until I can't harp any longer. You know, I just shot, about a week ago, I shot a engine inspection video series where I talked about plugs and some of the problems you can run into, and it happened again just a few days later. So I guess repetition really is a good teacher, so I'm just going to repeat myself. Remember, there's 3 reasons why you want to inspect your spark plugs. If you don't know the history of the car, you don't know who's been working on the car, even though someone told you or you have a receipt that the plugs have been replaced, you still need to look at them. Number 1, they may be the wrong spark plug. This is very common. I'm working on this E430 here. We're changing the plugs, and it has 16 spark plugs. So I know the temptation to go with the cheap plugs, because 16 times, you know, expensive is expensive. The other reason is someone who installed the plugs may have put an inordinate amount of some sort of goo on the threads, thinking this is really good, like excessive anti-seize or some sort of grease. And that's not good, and I'll explain that here in a few moments. And then finally, they may not be torqued properly. I've seen plugs loose over and over again, particularly if they use excessive amounts of some sort of anti-seize or some sort of goo like you see on the plugs here that we just removed from this M113 engine. Let me show you what I found on these plugs. Now remember, I was getting a check engine light that showed a misfire on number 1 cylinder, so maybe we're seeing why it was misfiring. Whatever was used on these threads doesn't look like any type of anti-seize I've seen. It looks more like lithium grease, but it's just kind of oozing out the back and all over the washer. And this was on all the plugs, excessive. You can see some of the fouling on the tips. I don't know if those plugs were even firing properly, but I did find one of them that was loose, but let's talk a little bit more about what we're seeing right here as it relates to misfire. I have the new correct Bosch plugs ready to install, and I just want to talk a little bit more about this problem with putting a whole bunch of goo on the threads. I know old school is, yeah, you don't want them to seize in the heads, but the problem with these newer computer controlled cars is they have such a very high voltage spark, and it needs a super good ground. And if you have any intermittent grounding of the plug due to excessive anti-seize or lithium grease like you saw on those other plugs, that firing in that plug could break down and it will throw a check engine light. If you put too much on, it can actually work its way out into the exhaust and foul up your O2 sensor. A lot of manufacturers now are saying no anti-seize. In fact, a lot of the newer plugs have a special coating on the threads that will help to minimize seizing in the plugs. You know, I know some of you say, well, I have an engine that's high salt area and we have problems with with plugs freezing up in a block. If you do use anti-seize, put just a little bit on the threads, just a little bit. It doesn't take very much to prevent seizing, and make sure it's towards the top of the threads. So when you're changing plugs, be sure and torque them properly, and pay attention to the part number. Don't go into some auto parts store and have some counter guy who says, "Oh no, man, we got these plugs that are every bit as good as the ones that are recommended by the manufacturer." No, 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 no. You use the manufacturer specific plugs or you're going to have troubles. Now, we're also working on a video for you, M112 and M113 engine owners. I'm going to shoot a video on changing the plugs in these engines as well as doing motor mounts, because a lot of times it's good to do those at the same time. So let's say you're thinking about taking on this job yourself. Either you want to take the plugs out and inspect them like I have done, or you just want to buy new ones and replace them. I will not go over the step-by-step instructions of how to do this in this video. There are tons of videos available on YouTube about changing spark plugs, so I'll probably be repeating myself, but you're going to need a few tools. Number one, you're going to need a boot removal tool that looks just like this. You can Google this and find this on a number of different vendors on the internet. This is the tool that you will need for the M112, that's the V6 engines, and the M113 V8 engines, to get in there and pop those spark plug wires off the spark plug. The next thing is you'll need a way to blow out the dirt down around the spark plug holes, and this is what works best. You can get a very inexpensive air gun and attach a fuel hose to it, and this will let you get down in there around the corners and blow those areas out. This is a must. You must blow the recess holes and the plugs out, or you'll let dirt fall down into the engine, and that's really bad. And then finally, you're going to need, a typical spark plug socket, and I highly recommend a torque wrench. You can get by without it. I've seen, like I said, a lot of problems with loose plugs because they have not been torqued properly. So those are not expensive tools. They're tools that you may not have if you're just beginning, starting out working on your own Mercedes. But you might want to pick these up, because some of these tools you can use in a lot of other applications, as you will see later in some of the other videos in this series. So don't be afraid to tackle spark plugs on your own.